Okay, so our next speaker is Sebastian Musslick. Sebastian is a fourth-year graduate student in John Cohen's Neuroscience of Cognitive Control lab at Princeton. He's asked me to identify him as a theoretical computational cognitive scientist, cognitive psychologist. He has a diploma, which is a master's equivalent from the Technical University of Dresden, where he worked with Thomas Goschke. He has won many fellowships and awards, both here and back in Germany, including an award for mentoring. I think Sebastian's been mentoring and working with quite an army of undergraduates, all working on different kind of aspects of various problems. He's also been the focal point of a number of different collaborations between the neuroscientists here and engineers and computer scientists. And he will talk to us a little bit about some paths from psychology to applied math and back to psychology. Thank you. Welcome.
Well, thank you for this very nice introduction. Okay, so in this workshop today, we're going to hear, and we already heard a lot about really interesting insights into theoretical insights into deep networks in terms of their capabilities in machine learning and artificial intelligence. But there are, I would like to convince you in this talk that there are also very interesting insights that we can gain from psychology and observations made in cognitive psychology. And so, as some of you may know, psychologists like to use neural networks as models of the cognitive function. And they've done this relatively successfully, especially since the 80s, based on pioneering work by Dave Rummelhart and Jay McClelland. And many of you will probably know, at least remember one of those names. And so in this talk, I would like to convince you that it's actually worth studying psychological phenomena using neural networks, and that the insights that we can gain from these studies can relate to more general principles in neural network architectures that in the end will be relevant for machine learning. So if we think about the human brain as a computational architecture, it's actually really hard to disregard its structural capacity. You know, with billions of neurons and trillions of synapses. And this computational capacity equips us with quite an amazing flexibility to execute a variety of tasks, right, and complex tasks. And so most of these tasks require us to flexibly allocate attention in correspondence with certain task goals. And in most of those tasks, we seem to be able to execute them quite effortlessly. But these are considered hard tasks in machine learning. But if I ask some of you to execute multiple of these tasks at the same time, then the number of tasks that you can actually execute at the same time is relatively small. And that seems quite striking, given that you should compare this to the structural capacity of the brain. Just think about how hard it is to listen to this talk and at the same time plan your grocery list and maybe perform mental arithmetic. Now, if I would ask you to do this, you would laugh, and that's quite insane, right? But compare this to the structural capacity of the brain. There seems to be some kind of mismatch. And this is kind of the striking thing from cognitive psychology, that we have an amazing limitation in terms of the amount of tasks that we can execute at the same time. And the question is this limitation an inability of humans themselves? Or does it maybe reflect some kind of more general principle of neural architectures in general that also applies to artificial systems that we use in machine learning? And so, of course, we would favor the latter hypothesis, that this reflects a general principle. And in this talk, I would like to convince you that this principle is basically a fundamental trade-off between the ability to learn quickly through the use of shared representations in neural networks and the ability to multitask using separate representations. So, to motivate the formalism and there's a question. Yeah.
Do you know anything about it?
No, that's a really good question. As a cognitive psychologist, usually I'm not interested in octopi, but it's a really good question, and I think it is certainly of relevance in the sense that animals tend to not exert this kind of flexibility in behavior that we have in terms of flexibly allocating attention. They're operating very much based on reflexes and automatic processes. And as I'll show you, this is exactly the recipe for these kind of automatic processes, is exactly a separation of representations. So this comes at the benefit of being able to execute multiple things in parallel really quickly, but it comes at the loss of generalization performance and learning speed. So indeed, there is a relationship. Okay, and so to motivate the formalism that I'm going to introduce, and this is going to be a graph theory-based formalism, I would like to perform an experiment with you like the one that we usually perform in the lab with humans. And so please bear with me through this psychological introduction until we get to the formalism. Now in this experiment, I'm going to ask you to do the following. I'm going to ask you to name the color of the following stimulus, and at the same time point to where it is. So I'm going to give you an example. In this case, you're supposed to point to the right, and at the same time say yellow. Okay, so this is a multitasking condition. Now, let me start the task. Okay, ready? Go. Okay, so we're all able to do this relatively quickly and without any effort. And this was a multitasking. Now I'm going to teach you a new task. And in this new task, I'm going to ask you to point to the left if you see the word red, and point to the right if you see the word green. Okay, ready? Just point. Don't say anything. Yeah. Okay. So all of you were able to learn this task very quickly. And that's already remarkable. And if you think about, neural networks, they actually tend to use some time in order to learn that quickly. So what I'm going to ask you now is basically perform exactly the same task that you just learned, but at the same time, just name the color of the word. So like you did in the beginning. For instance, in this case, you're supposed to point to the left because the word says red, but also say blue at the same time, okay? So you're already laughing. Something is signaling your brain that this might be a little trickier. Okay, ready? Okay. So as you all noticed, this is really tricky to do. And actually, we performed this study with Princeton undergrads and found that they also perform really poorly in this task, below chance, in fact. And so while they're able to learn the first task, which is a multitasking condition, naming the color and pointing to the location of a word, they were also able to learn a new task, but for some reason they're not able to learn the last task. And so now the question is, why can we multitask certain tasks but not others? Can we find principles in neural network architectures that allow us to determine which tasks can be executed in parallel and which do not? And so to basically explain why we perform well in some conditions, not in others, let me introduce you to a very simple neural network model of multitasking. So this is a standard neural network model that you all know from machine learning. It consists of an input layer, in this case, that represents colors. It's a stimulus that is then mapped to an internal representation through a hidden layer with nonlinear activation function, and eventually reaches a response layer at which the output is indicated. In this case, it's a verbal response. So naming a color would be a task that requires mapping colors onto verbal responses. So this is very classic machine learning-like architecture. Think about it as mapping some kind of image to a label. And now, since we're interested in multitasking, we'd like to teach network not just one task, but more. And we can do this easily by extending the input layer, just by a few more dimensions, and representing words in the input layer. And at the same time, we can do this for the output layer, so now that we can also indicate manual responses, let's say, like pointing to the screen. I can also ask the network, for instance, to learn to map words onto verbal responses. And as you might intuit, and sort of the previous talk gave an intuition for why this might be a good idea, it is efficient to actually use existing representations rather than building new ones. And so we could easily build use the representations for word in the hidden layer and just remap that onto the output. This is a very efficient way of learning and acquiring this task. And finally, we can represent the third task that we performed, which is mapping locations onto manual responses. Now, as is, this network implements quite a lot of tasks. And now, so how do we decide which one to execute at any given moment, right? We can train a network on all of those tasks, but the network needs to have some information about which tasks to execute. So to do this, we introduce the notion of control. And this is related to cognitive control in cognitive psychology. Think about control as a signal from an additional input layer that indicates the current task to be performed. And so this is just really simple, a simple additional net input that is provided to these units. And when a network learns based on this task input and the input of the stimulus, it will learn to essentially use this as a gating signal. So what this effectively does, it basically pushes the net input within the sigmoid function in the linear domain, which makes it very sensitive to the net input. Otherwise, these units will be just turned off by a negative bias. And so you can think about this cognitive control simply as gating units that basically can turn on and off units in this network at the hidden layer and at the output layer. Now with this setup, we're easily able to execute a single task and select the task we want to perform by simply activating the units representing representations for instance, color, but also for verbal responses. And now the neural network is able to perform exactly that mapping and not the other mappings. We can also multitask with the setup, simply by turning on the corresponding representations for the second task. For instance, like you did in the beginning of the experiment, mapping locations onto menu responses. And you're all able to do this, and so is the network. However, multitasking is not always possible, also in this network. Think about the following situation in which you would like to map colors onto verbal responses and the word onto menu responses, like pointing to the screen, like you did in the beginning of at the end of the experiment. Now, in this case, the network is not able to do it. Why is that? In order to execute these two tasks, you would need to gate information through the neurons representing color information and word information, but also you would need to activate the corresponding output dimensions, verbal and manual responses. But by doing so, you implicitly let through information through this other path from the word representations to the verbal representations, which you do not want, right? You want to map color onto verbal, not word onto verbal. So the color output layer basically now receives information from two things, from the colors represented at the hidden layer and the words represented at the hidden layer. And this is because you're implicitly engaging word representations to be transmitted to the verbal layer, because you need to activate those in order to perform the word to manual task, right? You could easily avoid this issue. You could simply say, all right, let me just turn off those word units. And when you do that, well, then you're just not able to perform the word mapping task anymore. So there is no way around. And so we actually argue that our brain is built to avoid this type of interference and is on purpose limiting ourselves to execute multiple tasks at the same time. And but now you might ask, okay, well, you know, this is just a very few tasks and the brain is so big, we're representing so many things. Is it really the case that these kind of shared representations are really causing, you know, us to limit us to one or two tasks overall that we can execute at the same time? Well, to answer this question, we need to abstract away from this model. And what we are going to do is we're going to say, all right, let's treat this model as a directed bipartite graph in which the input nodes correspond to the hidden activation, the hidden representations of the network, like colors, words, and locations. And the output nodes correspond to the verbal and manual response dimensions. And each edge is basically a task. It's a mapping that is, can be executed by the network. So now that we have this set up, we can ask for a given network, you know, what is the maximum number of tasks that the network can perform at the same time without any interference, without any loss in performance? And so for this network, the answer seems quite simple, and we already know it, right? So this is not a very exciting question to ask, but what if I give you a larger network with multiple tasks? Can you tell me how many tasks this network can perform in parallel without interference? It's not that easy to tell right now from this view. And so now what we want is we want to derive a formalism that allows us to determine this number, this capacity of the network, and then eventually empirically validate it in real neural networks. Now, also note that I haven't told you exactly how to map a neural network onto this graph. I'm going to tell you about that much later, and it will hopefully convince you that this is a reasonable abstraction. So now, in order to determine whether we can execute tasks in parallel or not, we would like to define dependency between tasks. So let me introduce these definitions. To do this, we consider the task graph, and we also consider a dependency graph, which denotes dependencies between tasks. Note that the tasks in the dependency graph are now nodes, not edges anymore. And so in this very simple system, we can define three types of dependencies. In the first type of dependencies, you have the two tasks A and B converging on the same output, right? And you can easily argue, well, there is a dependency between these two tasks, because it's like as if you would like to say, respond to the word and the color at the same time with your mouth. You cannot pronounce the two things at the same time. It's impossible, right? What if the color says green and the word says red? You can't really do this at the same time. Therefore, these tasks need to be considered dependent on one another. We can simply put an edge between them in a dependency graph. Now, there's another type of dependency that is not necessarily impacting performance, but is important for the definition of what constitutes a multitasking condition. Here, two tasks B and C rely on the same input dimension. And it's as if mapping the same input to two different outputs. Now, from a formal point of view, this might not constitute a multitasking condition because it's a little unfair. I'm just mapping the same thing onto two different things. So I could call this as well a single task. So what constitutes a multitasking condition is really just mapping two independent things to outputs, to independent outputs. Therefore, we also consider these to be dependent in the dependency graph. And finally, there is this third notion of dependence, which gets a little bit more tricky, and you can consider it as some kind of interaction between the first two. Where you consider the two tasks A and C, you'll notice that they are indirectly connected by means of B. And this is exactly the experimental condition that we engaged in the beginning. Executing tasks A and C would require to basically gate information through both input representations at the hidden layer, here denoted as the input nodes, and but also activate the corresponding output dimensions. And by doing so, you will implicitly engage task B, which creates interference and therefore dependence. And so for any given task graph, I can count all of these dependencies and add them up together. So I can get a dependency graph. And so for those who are more familiar with graph theory, you'll notice that the dependency graph is simply the square of the line graph of the task, bipartite task graph. Now, given that I have a complicated task graph, I can derive this dependency graph. And I can now ask the question, how many tasks can this graph perform at the same time? And the answer to this question amounts to identifying the maximum independent set of the dependency graph, which is simply the set of nodes in which no two nodes are connected by one another. And that is the largest set. Note that there could be multiple solutions, right? I could have multiple maximum independent sets. But what I'm interested here in particular is the cardinality of that set. That is the number of tasks I can execute at maximum in a given network. And so once I've identified that, for instance, for this graph, I can go back and test the real network if that is actually possible. So with this object of study, I can ask a bunch of questions. Now to answer the questions regarding the brain. How does, for instance, the parallel processing capacity, here formalized as the maximum independent set of the dependency graph, scale as a function of variables parameters or properties of the task bipartite graph? For instance, like the size of the graph, how many tasks I'm actually representing, how many representations do I have available in the brain? What is the amount of overlap between the tasks? That's what we think is the critical parameter. And that's simply the out degree of the bipartite graph. Or what is maybe even the distribution of the task graph, and how does it relate to its capacity? And so to take the first two, we can essentially vary the amount of out degree in the bipartite graph, which we conceptualize as something like process overlap, that is the overlap between tasks, and ask how does the maximum independent set scale as a function of that? And you can see that on average, as I increase the out degree, the process overlap P, the maximum parallel processing capacity just drops rapidly. And this effect, this capacity seems to be much less sensitive to the network size. That is, sharing representations in a network seems to really impact overall performance quite drastically. And small amounts of these kind of overlap are sufficient to constrain our parallel processing capability. Now you might say, all right, you've given me a particular weird example. If I'm really smart, I can actually configure this network with the same distribution, with the same out degree, regular out degree, and just concentrate all the tasks on one single output node. In that way, I can artificially increase the parallel processing capacity of the network. And the way I can quantify the difference between these two is by means of basically entropy over the in degrees of the output nodes. That's what we call distribution complexity. Right, so the one above has just a more uniform distribution among the output use in terms of the in degrees. That's just a higher entropy than the lower one. So now I can now ask for a given distribution complexity. How does the parallel processing capacity scale as a function of this process overlap between tasks? And you can see that on average, this is kind of this nonlinear decreasing function. With the minimum, if I always picked the optimal solution, I can actually get just a linear decrease, which is quite good. That's not that bad. But if I, on the other hand, consider the maximum entropy over the distributions, I get quite a drastic decrease. And I can scale this up and again ask, how does it scale as the function of the network size? And here you can see that just a small amount of overlap just completely lets your multitasking capability drop. And that seems quite striking. Now, okay, this is all theoretical, and I haven't yet convinced you that this is actually relevant to understanding neural networks and actually real neural networks that we use in machine learning. So to demonstrate this, I would like to show you that that we're able to essentially use this theory, and if this theory is in some way true or right, then it should make accurate predictions about the parallel processing capability of neural architectures. So what we could do is we could say, let's analyze the representations of neural networks and use them to derive a dependency graph. Once we have the dependency graph, we should be able to predict the multitasking capacity of a real neural network. And so to do this, let me introduce you to a simple toy example. This is a very standard neural network with an input layer and a task layer that encodes the stimulus and the task to be performed respectively. And this input is mapped to a hidden layer at which the stimulus is basically represented and filtered, and then mapped onto an output layer. And the output layer, note that the output layer here is grouped into 3 output dimensions, verbal, joystick, and keyboard responses, for instance. And the input layer is grouped into input dimensions, colors, words, and locations. And we can define a task simply as a mapping from one particular input dimension to a particular output dimension. And so I want to be clear that this is just a randomly initialized network that will be trained on all of these possible mappings. And just to illustrate you what I mean by those mappings, consider the input of a stimulus is just an n-hot vector, where basically I only turn on 1 unit per input dimension. And I also give it the corresponding task or mapping, so that the network knows which task, which mapping to perform. And that input gets mapped onto the hidden layer and then correspondingly mapped to the output layer. Where here we just want to perform one-to-one mappings, mapping the first unit in the first input dimension to the first unit in the output dimension. Now, for instance, if I change the task, I might consider a different mapping from the word input dimension to the verbal output dimension. In this case, I would require to activate the second unit in the output layer, and the network has to learn it based on the task context that is provided in this additional input layer. Now, let's say we train this network, and remember there are 3 inputs dimensions and 3 output dimensions. That means we can represent 3 by 3 equals 9 tasks. We can train this network on all of them, and now we will ask, okay, let's just take the representations of the network and construct this task graph, from which we can then derive the dependency graph. So what we really want is for any given 2 tasks, we want to decide, shall we let them rely on the same input node, on the same hidden representation, or not? And to do this, we can, one way of doing this is basically to compute the average hidden unit activity for a given task and store this as a vector. And we do the same for the other task. And then we can ask, are they similar or not? One way of doing this is by computing the correlation and comparing this against some threshold. And if the threshold is exceeded, we say that these 2 tasks rely on the same node. Now, in general, these analyses and results that I'm going to show you are very robust to the threshold being picked. These correlations tend to be quite large in this case. And you might also ask, why are you doing this over the activity of the network? Since you have access to the weights, you should be able to do this in a more clean way. But the motivation is in some way twofold. On the one hand, we usually don't have access to the weights if we consider biological systems, right? We usually only have access to the activity space, not the weight space necessarily, at least not directly through measurement. The second aspect is that by using the activity, I can be somewhat agnostic to the architecture. And this is also something interesting. It's more of a feature than a bug of this theory. So now I can play this game for all of the possible tasks. For instance, tasks A and C. I'll compare their mean activation vectors in the hidden layer to decide whether they rely on similar nodes or not. Now in this case, they look quite differently. So I'm going to let them rely on different nodes. And I'm going to play this game for all of the possible task pairs. And finally, I need to do the same for the output layer. I need to essentially decide, do tasks A and D, for instance, rely on the same output node. Now that I know, because I trained the network to respond in a particular output dimension. But I could also theoretically just use the mean activity of the network and compare it against some threshold for 2 tasks. So I can do this for all of the task pairs. And now I can derive the dependency graph. Now the dependency graph tells me which task can I execute in parallel and which not. Now in this case, A and I, for instance, they're indicated to be not dependent on one another, according to this graph. And if it would be really true, then it would mean that if I turn on both task units, then the network should be able to perform it independently. And now note, the network was not trained on multitasking at all. It was only trained on single tasks. All I'm going to do is just activate 2 tasks units at the same time for the same stimulus. And I can ask, if the mapping would be really independent, in the extreme case, there would be separate networks essentially, right? Then there should be no issue with performance. And this is what this thing would predict, this dependency graph. Now, but let's go from the high level to the more fine-grained level. Imagine I extracted a dependency graph from a network. I can now ask, what's the maximum independent set of that graph? What is the maximum capacity of that network? In this case, it's 3. It tells me that the cardinality of that set is 3. So I can say, all right, this is sort of the capacity of the network. Now what I can do is I can take this network and test it on all possible sets of tasks with different cardinality, from like sets of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. And I can measure the performance of the network. And what I'm going to indicate here or plot here is the best performance for any given set size. Now, what you would predict is after this vertical line, you should see a drop in performance, right? Because this is past the predicted parallel processing capability of the network. And this is just one example. This is sort of like an exemplary network for which it works. You can see the performance, the parallel processing performance is quite high, up to a set size of 3. But then after that, it drops rapidly. And we can do this across a bunch of networks. And since different networks have different predicted set sizes, we can align this, this vertical line to the predicted maximum independent set. So now the vertical line indicates always this predicted capacity, and every one of these lines indicates a neural network with different predicted MIS. And you can see that for different sizes of the network, we can always in some way predict the parallel processing capability in the sense that we can predict when the performance is going to drop in terms of the set size. Now you will notice that the prediction isn't perfect. There are certain graphs that, for which we basically underestimate the parallel processing capability. They perform better than expected. And it remains to be, that remains to be solved, why this is the case and why this theory doesn't work as well in this case. Okay, so now let's maybe ask a more fine-grained question. We can not only reason about the overall capacity, we can also ask about particular tasks. And this is where it gets really interesting in practice. Imagine a huge task space, and we want to make predictions about all the possible combinations of tasks. Now I can do this easily from the dependency graph. I can simply extract sets of tasks that are dependent, which are here indicated in brown, and things that are considered to be independent based on this dependency graph that is derived from the representations of the network. Now I can compare the performance of these 2 sets, for instance, for any given set size. Now the set size is 2. Right, and I can measure the mean squared error for both. I would predict that the mean squared error for the dependent tasks is always higher than for independent tasks. And so this is what the data indicates, and I can do this, extend this to larger set sizes, and you will see that that's usually the case. So this graph makes accurate predictions about which tasks should be interfering and which shouldn't. Now, I can also ask even more fine-grained questions. Unlike the dependency graph, the original task graph that we constructed is directional, and we can leverage that. Consider the following scenario. In this case, I have a subset of tasks A and C, for which I predict that they're dependent on one another. Therefore, your multitasking performance shouldn't be as good. But I can actually predict a little more than that. I can say that multitasking performance should be particularly impaired for task A as opposed to task C, because task A receives this interfering information from task B through the representation that is used for task C. So I should be able to use this in order to make more accurate predictions about the activity on the output layer for these networks. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically extract pairs of tasks, and I'm going to look at the network's activations in terms of the output. So in this instance, I'm considering a very simple network that has input dimensions with just 3 units. And the network is always asked to perform one-to-one mappings for these tasks. Here it's simply mapping the first and second input dimension to the first and second output respectively. That means activating the first output unit in response to the first unit of the first input dimension, the color, and the second output unit in response to the second unit in the second input dimension of the words. So in gray, you will see what is supposed to happen. This is the correct response of the network. What is indicated in blue is the actual true activation of the network on average for this instance. And so in this case, I predicted that there is actually no dependency between tasks. So this is what I want to see. Now what happens if I predict this type of interference for two tasks? What would you expect? You would expect that performance is particularly impaired in the left task, right? Because it's the one that receives interference from the right. And you'll see that the right task is somewhat also impaired, and this is somewhat interesting. I'm not really sure yet why this is the case, but it seems to be that there is an asymmetric relationship here that is predicted and confirmed. And finally, we consider the worst case, in which basically both tasks interfere with each other. And so in this case, you would basically predict complete failure of the network, multitasking failure. And you'll see this. And notice that you'll also see a systematicity. That is, the activity of these output units in some way reflects the activity of the other units in the input layer of the competing dimension, right? So it's never the case that the third output unit is activated. This is because there's no information that would be interfering. But the information is really coming from the alternative input dimension that is producing this interference. So this is also kind of a sanity check. And now, to wrap this sort of up, these simulation results essentially in some way validates the graph-theoretic formalism, and that is a useful abstraction at the very least. But we can also, it also has actually more interesting practical implications if you think about the complexity of the problem. In order to derive this dependency graph, we only need to take a linear amount of measures for each individual task to extract task representations, and a quadratic amount of computations to derive this graph. But the graph itself allows to predict a space that is factorially large. It allows to make predictions about all possible combinations of multitasking conditions. And that is quite huge. And just now imagine this in practice. For instance, consider a pilot in a pilot cockpit. And consider diagnosing the necessity to diagnose this pilot for his or her proficiency in the cockpit. Now, what you would like to do is you would like to assess their multitasking performance. That's obviously impossible if you have 100 tasks. Even with 10 tasks, it goes into the millions, 3 millions of multitasking combinations that you can perform. So, so what you would like to do is instead just perform a simple linear amount of measurements, put them in an fMRI scanner, for instance, measure their brain activity, and then use that to predict multitasking performance. This is sort of the neuroscientific or psychological application of this. But it obviously might be also relevant in domains of machine learning. Now, given that we sort of validated this graph-theoretic account, we can now perform some more interesting theoretical questions, or we can approach them at least, since this formalism seems to be somewhat justified. And so, previously we asked, what is the overall capacity of the network? But you might want to ask a more practical question. If I give you any set of tasks, what is the minimum proportion of those that you can perform at the same time? So this is a different question. And we can ask this question. And this work that I'm going to show you has mostly been done by Daniel Reichman, who is a theoretical computer scientist at Berkeley. So to derive this formalism, consider very simple terminology in computer science in which we consider a matching. That's simply a set of vertex disjoint edges. Now in this case, this is a necessary condition for multitasking. Remember the definition of multitasking I gave in the beginning, which I want to say that if I give you a set of tasks, it's only a multitasking condition if all the tasks map different inputs to different outputs. This is what a matching would be in this graph. Now, in order to be able to perform multitasking, you need to have an induced matching, which is a matching with no two edges connected by a third edge. And so this would be considered sufficient because it means that there is no dependency between tasks. And finally, we're going to perform these analyses only on regular graphs, which means that all the vertices have the same degree. So now, for a given graph, I can define a quantity alpha, and this is very related to this kind of motivation I just gave. Alpha is basically the proportion of tasks for a given matching that is induced. So it's basically, if I give you a matching, a set of tasks that I'm asking you to perform, what is the minimum amount of tasks you can actually execute in parallel. That is, what is the minimum cardinality of the induced matching? So in this very small example, alpha is 1.5. Just consider the set of two tasks, the left one and the right one. So in this case, you only perform one of the tasks, even if I give you two, because of this interfering task in the middle. So alpha is 1/2 of that set. You can perform 1/2 of this set. And using inequalities, you can show that this alpha is upper bounded by e to the power of 2 approximated by 9 divided by the square root of d. And this yields some interesting insights into these networks. For instance, we can again confirm that the capacity of a neural network decays with the degree, that is, with the amount of sharing between representations in the network. And this finding seems to be universal. This means that it applies to any deregular graph, first of all, but more importantly, it's independent of the size of the network, which is quite striking and quite important, right? It's what matters is not necessarily the structural capacity. It really is the amount of sharing and what you would call effective parameters in a network that matters. So more interestingly, you can extend this analysis to deep networks, or deep graphs in this case. You consider R-layered graphs, and you can show that alpha is bounded also in some way by the depth of the network, here shown on this axis on the right. Now, you need to be careful though, because alpha is only meaningful within a range of between 0 and 1, and this approximation, this upper bound, can be relatively meaningless if R is large relative to D. So therefore, we need to be a little bit careful, but it gives us a sense that the depth of the network also somewhat constrains the parallel processing capacity of the network. And here, this would be formalized or basically as the induced path rather than the induced matching, right? So I would like to identify tasks that interfere at no point among the network as I step up. So now, what I've shown you so far is that, and I hope to convince you that shared representations are bad for parallel processing. And we can use these graph-theoretic tools to study this. Now, from a machine learning perspective, this might be not so interesting, because right now, if I want to parallelize, I can just take a computer and set up the same system on a different computer. Now I can parallelize two networks if I want to, without any worries. But imagine building an autonomous agent in which you cannot do this. You just have to decide once and for all what is going to be the architecture without cloning it every time you have to do multiple tasks at the same time. So this is going to be relevant once you consider autonomous agents. And it is going to be relevant also in terms of learning. Because we can simply ask, if this is true, and this might be the case for artificial as well as biological systems, why would such a system ever use shared representations? If I were the designer of a neural network, why would I, given these findings, ever decide to make it have shared representations? I would just simply build separate representations for every possible task. That's the best thing to do. But sort of the previous talk kind of hinted at the fact that this is not really efficient, and indeed it might hurt learning. And so we know very well from machine learning theory that having shared representations is actually good for generalization and learning efficiency. And so in particular, consider the multitask learning framework that was formalized actually originally by Jonathan Baxter in more formal terms, and then more empirically by Rich Caruana. And so the idea is that you take the same neural network and you train it on multiple tasks. Those are called auxiliary tasks because they're not really of interest. What you're really interested in is training it on a final task that is somewhat related. And what we will usually find is training it on these auxiliary tasks essentially leads to an inductive bias in the network that improves learning performance on the primary task. Not only that it speeds up learning, it also improves generalization performance. So in that sense, actually, machine learning in the machine learning domain, shared representations are desired because they're assumed to be the reason for this improved generalization performance and learning efficiency. And so in general, you see the title right there, interactive versus independent parallelism. You can think about interactive parallelism here as the ability of neural networks to let representations interact through the means of sharing for the purpose of inference and learning. But what we want for multitasking is indeed independent parallelism. So that's something different. Now just move on. Princeton alert. is reminding me, both in my phone and on the computer, that something is happening on the South Street. Okay, so if this is the case, if shared representations are good for learning, but they're bad for multitasking, then there must be some kind of relationship. And there might be actually a formal trade-off between these two, a fundamental computational trade-off that exists in biological and artificial systems. So to illustrate this, consider this very simple network with 2 input dimensions, 2 output dimensions, and the setup. In this case, we already know we have these gating signals that can execute a single task or multiple ones at the same time. And here notice that the 2 tasks that rely on the same input dimension, x1, rely on shared representation in the hidden layer. And you can easily show, as you don't need much math to do this, that the weights between the input layer and the hidden layer basically would receive twice the gradient, right? Because both tasks use the same representation, so you would simply add up those gradients and benefit in terms of learning speed if these gradients point in the same direction. And they, in this case, they would, because it's just a simple one-to-one mapping from the input space to the output space, which turns out to be crucial in the end. But with the setup, with the sharing, we also know that we can only perform one task at a time because we have this interference between others. So now, how can I reconfigure this network so to make it able to multitask, to execute multiple things in parallel? I can simply dedicate a hidden representation to each single task. And now I have separated the representations. And I should be able to parallelize tasks. But first, let's look at the sort of the training signals for this scenario. In this case, this one task now receives a single training signal per task because there's only one task per representation. It means that the lower weights from the input to the hidden layer are trained slower. On the other hand, I get better multitasking performance. I can now execute 2 tasks at the same time. And indeed, multitasking performance is just bounded by the dimensionality of the input and output space. So I'm not going to get very much into the formalism because Andrew is going to talk about this later. But what Andrew basically showed is that you can essentially generalize this in a linear system, the setup in which these gating signals simply just are multiplicative gates that let information pass or not. And you can show that based on his solutions for learning dynamics in linear systems, you can show that the learning time of a neural network, that the time is required to learn, squared, is proportional to the desired multitasking capacity. That means the number of tasks you would actually like to execute at the same time. And, but it's also affected by the number of tasks that actually share something in the input dimension. And so this is a formal trade-off that can be derived in, for linear systems at the very least. But it's something that what we think is very critical and general, that applies to biological systems as well as artificial systems. And it might explain in some way why we're so limited, why the brain actually chooses to represent tasks in a shared way. It's because it's beneficial for learning in the first place. If I would want to learn a bunch of tasks, it's better to share and reuse existing representations to just learn them way more effectively, rather than thinking about parallel processing in the end. So in some ways, we're still optimal in that sense, at least along this trade-off. And so you might ask, well, in biological as well as artificial system, you might have certain biases towards these shared representations that would make them exert these kind of limitations in multitasking. And so there may be intrinsic as well as extrinsic biases. And what I mean by that is that these biases might come from the environment externally, or you could design such biases as as meta-parameters in a neural network. And so to illustrate this, consider again this very simple network from the beginning with 3 input and output dimensions. Now if I train this network on these tasks, I can vary the amount of overlap in the input space. So what I can do is I can say, I consider a condition in which 2 tasks rely on totally separate input units. That is really different features in the input space. Think about it, features that are completely orthogonal, like for example in an image. But I can also vary this. I can say, well, there might be situations in which they partially overlap, in which they have some relevant information that is being shared in the input space. Or they might be completely overlapping. It's exactly the same information that is relevant for both tasks. So I can vary this from having completely different input dimensions to the same, essentially. And what you can show is that if you subject the network to an environment with shared features, first of all, what we observe, and we know this since at the very least since 1986, by work from Jeff Hinton, that the task correlations will be the tasks will be highly correlated in terms of their hidden representations. That is, the neural network will naturally extract shared structure that is there, and Andrew is showing this more formally in his work on in linear systems. But more critically, in those environments in which tasks overlap in terms of their input spaces, multitasking accuracy of the network drops. And this is interesting, because it means that in some way our capacity to multitask also depends on the task environment. If there's a lot of shared structure, then neural networks tend to extract the structure at the various backpropagation. It tends to do this. But this also means bad multitasking performance in this case. But I can also do this in a more causal way. I can basically say, all right, let's actually let's actually bias the network towards either shared or separate representations. And the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to vary the correlation among the weight vectors from the task layer to the hidden layer. I can make them completely overlapping. This would be amount to using exactly the same units in the hidden layer. Or I can make them partially overlapping, or not at all overlapping. And so I can simply initialize the weights to rely on separate versus shared representations. And now I can ask, how does the performance of the network depend on this? And I can see that if I initialize the network to rely on shared representations, here colors indicated in yellow, then the network learns really quickly, meaning that it needs only a few iterations to train. However, this comes at the cost of multitasking performance. Multitasking performance is relatively poor. And then you can see that if I increase the separation between representations initially, it's only during the initialization process, then I will slow down the network because it takes longer to train there is no sharing among the gradients, but the multitasking accuracy goes up. And now I can combine this finding with the previous one and ask, how does this trade-off play out in different environments? And you can see that this trade-off is only really clearly expressed in environments in which there is shared structure to be exploited, which makes sense. Biasing a network towards shared representations only makes sense if there is shared structure in the environment that can be represented efficiently. If that's not the case, then you won't see a benefit in terms of learning, but you will still see a decrement in terms of multitasking. You will still see the main effect that shared representations are bad for multitasking. So now I have like a few minutes left, and so I would like to jump ahead and show you how can I show my hidden slides. Yeah. All slides. Here we go. So, yeah. So what we've learned so far is that we have this trade-off that shared representations are bad, but they're also good for learning efficiency. So we can now ask, how do we overcome those shared representations? And this is sort of some way we can use this theory to make predictions in the real world with real agents. And to give you one example, actually this idea has been formulated very early. The question is, how do we overcome parallel processing constraints? How do we become experts and automatize things? And so there is this very interesting article, Scientific American, from a woman named Thea Alba, a German woman. And the article is actually written by a chemist who reasons about psychology and basically gives the first idea to this formalism that the reason why someone would be able to multitask really well is not because they have multiple control systems that allow them to basically execute multiple tasks at the same time. It's more because these task pathways are highly automatized and specialized, basically relying on separate representations. That's the idea. And so in this case, this was really striking because this woman was able to perform multiple tasks in parallel, writing different words with different output dimensions onto the board, which is quite striking. And now people ask, well, does she have just multiple consciousness, multiple brains, essentially? And obviously the answer is no, but that was clearly a hypothesis. And so the author was arguing, no, it is the case that this special ability relies on separate pathways. And you can make an interesting prediction based on that, which was unfortunately never tested. That is, if this is the case, then her multitasking capabilities should be very specific to only these tasks, not in general. It's not something special about the architecture that makes her multitask really well. It's the fact that she parallelized these tasks and she built up separate representations in her brain. And so we can basically simulate this and empirically validate this prediction by just taking a neural network and training it on multitasking and ask what happens. Now, if we do this on single tasking, we can essentially project the representations of the neural network here indicated as simple vectors with 13 hidden units. Here, a network was trained on 9 tasks, so there are nine vectors, and we can project these vectors onto a 2-dimensional plane using multidimensional scaling, and then ask how do these tasks relate to each other over the course of learning. And you can see that initially they're highly overlapping. Actually, you can barely see it. But the idea is that they form 3 clusters of 3 tasks. So all the tasks that share the same input dimension, they will be represented very similarly in the network. And I can perform the same analysis using a network that was trained on multitasking and single tasking at the same time. And so you will see that initially it has the same bias. It will start off with shared representations due to small weights. But in the end, hopefully is what you see, at least for the green dots, is that they separate. So inducing pressure for learning to multitask leads to a separation of representations. And this is exactly predicted by the graph theory. In order to improve my multitasking capability, I need to separate representations. And so we can ask, is this actually true for humans? And so, in fact, there was a study very recently performed by some people in Australia. It's unfortunately not a very well-controlled study, but it's the best we have as of now, where people have been trained on multitasking on 2 different tasks. Basically, the task was simply to categorize auditory tones and visual shapes. And there were 2 conditions. One condition, the group has been trained over, I think, weeks on this task. On the other condition, the control group wasn't trained. They were just performing some other tasks. Unfortunately, that doesn't allow us to make a lot of inferences about what happened here. But what we expect is that the group that was trained on multitasking actually has led to a separation of representations. And what they've done is what you can see essentially on this scatter plot in the middle, is they related the improvement in multitasking in this experiment group to the degree of separation. And they measured this degree of separation in terms of the ability to decode from the brain which task they're performing. The idea is very simple. If representation is separate, then it should be easier to classify the tasks based on representations. And you can see this is the case. And this is an indication for that representations are actually separating in humans as they get trained on multitasking. And this is what we think is going on when we automatize things. Now we can do a more controlled study using the setup we have and ask, what is it actually that drives the separation process in neural networks? And if you subject the network to just single task training versus dual task training, but only on stimuli that don't have any incongruent information, you will see that separation only happens if information is incongruent. And the idea is basically to become an expert and to be able to perform multitasking really well, you need to separate your representations. That is, for instance, the representations for your fingers in order to be able to play on piano. Now, to wrap up, we showed that shared representations constrain multitasking performance, that we can use graph theory to make interesting predictions about this performance in real neural networks, and that there's a fundamental trade-off between learning efficiency and parallel processing capability. So at the end, I would like to thank my advisor, John Cohen, and various people who've been involved in this work very actively, and also others that have been involved in various ends of this multitasking effort, and also the organizers of this meeting. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for questions. So, any questions?
Hi, thanks for the talk. I was wondering about, there's these more recent models that were like these generalized sequence-to-sequence transforms. I don't know if you're aware of them, where essentially we have a bunch of tasks which are reclassifying images, transforming an image into a sentence, translating something, and then what we do is we build like a modality which takes the input's representation, builds it into a shared representation, then we have some big network in the middle that somehow computes something like shared representation, and then we like put a network at the end to transform it back into our modality of interest. And these seem to like both learn a shared representation, but still be able to do all the tasks at once because it learns a shared representation that is somehow powerful enough to encode every possible task.
Yeah. So yeah. This is actually a tricky thing that I should have mentioned in the beginning. There is a different notation in terms of multitasking in the machine learning community and in the psychological community. What we mean by multitasking is true concurrent processing, parallel processing. That is in a single feed forward pass. How many things can I carry out at the same time? Whereas you might refer to the capability of neural networks to learn multiple tasks and be able to execute them in parallel. Or am I wrong in this?
So usually in these generalized sequence models, there's a part of weights which is shared between all the tasks, and then there are some weights that are specific to each task, and then you can potentially carry out all of them at the same time. That's just computational, right? But it's kind of more like the representation.
Right. So the question is, can you do that? Like, how does basically, if you compare the case in which you only would execute one task that the network is trained on, and compare it to the performance in which it would execute multiple tasks simultaneously in a single feed-forward pass, does the performance suffer? This is the question to ask in this case. And I would predict that because of the shared representation, if information is incongruent between the tasks, right? It's like as if you see the word in the beginning, if you see the word green in green color, there's no issues with multitasking that, right? Because the information is congruent. So that is also really critical. And you've got to identify conditions in which there's actually incongruent information. And because we think that the stimulus space is quite large, that is quite likely. But yeah, that's exactly the question to ask in this case.
Other questions?
Yeah, it seems like the experiment you started with has to do with short-term memory kinds of things.
Yeah.
And it's not clear if deep learning is the right model for it. I'm not convinced that any of these conclusions are. So,
yeah, okay, so this is great because now we're getting into the psychology of things. So yeah, so clearly the task that I asked you to do, for instance, the word mapping task, you can argue easily that this is relying on hippocampal representations. But hippocampal representations themselves, they rely on cortical representations. And so you might basically, if I would ask you, in order to learn this task, do you really learn to re-represent words in order to map them onto a screen? Or do you take existing words in your cortical domain and just link them via the hippocampus to the output? And so the prediction is that yes, there is task separation in the hippocampus, but eventually it converges on shared representations on the cortex. And by that, in that sense, it is kind of the right model because this is a model of cortical learning, and this is really true. But the other task that I showed you, for instance, mapping words onto verbal responses, this is something that is completely automatized. You would even argue that this is somewhere deep in even other brain systems, and it's completely relying on this kind of cortical mechanisms. Whereas, yes, to initially acquire the task, we need to rely on the hippocampus, but we can't just relearn how to represent things, how to reinterpret letters, basically, and form them into words. For that, we actually use existing knowledge, and this is exactly the kind of shared representation that is what we think is present in the neocortex. And where the hippocampus is really just a mediator to do this, but the limitation is still at the level of the cortex at which representations are shared.
One last question.
So the problem occurs with these networks that you've trained on individual tasks and then try to perform the multitasking condition.
Yeah.
So and clearly the solution is to train the network on the multitasking condition so long as it has the computational capacity to do so. But is the better learning strategy to learn the single tasks and then train on multitasking condition, or to learn the multitasking condition from the get-go?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's really tricky because it slightly depends on the initialization condition. In general, it's actually better for large initial weights, and maybe Andrew will hint at that in his talk. It's actually better to train straight away to in terms of the shared, the multitasking conditions right away. One problem that you see if you start training on the single tasks, you will see that it takes a long time to actually break the representations again for multitasking. So training initially on multitasking is good, but on the other hand, it takes longer relative to single task training under the same conditions. So you do not get the sharing benefits between tasks. So if you're in a situation in which you have to learn really fast and really quickly, and you really want to act soon, you don't just want to wait until you can perform everything, it's actually better to learn single tasking first.
Okay, so we end this session, and the lunch is outside, and we reconvene at 1:30 for the second session. Yeah, thank you all.